I wanted to put some historical context on today's $1,900 price of gold, right? Just kind of talking about where gold has been, over the centuries in the United States, where it started and where it is now. Because initially, the dollar was defined into law in 1792 with the Coinage Act of 1792. So that was the first act of Congress to legally establish the currency in the United States. And the reason Congress did that was because that's what the Constitution authorized them to do. And I've mentioned this before, but I'm just going to go over it again for people who didn't hear an earlier podcast. But if you want to see the monetary provisions, you got to look at both Article 1, Section 10 and Article 1, Section 8. So let's look at Article 1, Section 10 first, which denies powers to the states. Remember, the Constitution is set up in two ways. It denies powers to the states and grants powers to the federal government. So the federal government can only do what the Constitution specifically allows it to do. Those are enumerated powers. The states can do whatever they want except what is denied to them by the federal Constitution. Now, that doesn't mean the states are all powerful, because each state had its own constitution that limited the power of their state government. So the federal Constitution was not there to do that. It was just imposing some additional limitations on powers that were otherwise broad and non-enumerated and left to the states. So looking at Article 1, Section 10, says no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, confederation, grant letters of marque or reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debt. So there is what the Constitution says the federal government, the state governments can't do, right? They can't coin money, right? They can't take money and make it into a coin. They can't emit bills of credit, which is paper money, so they can't issue their own currency. And the only thing they can make legal tender in payment of debts is gold and silver coin. But they're not allowed to make the coins. They're only allowed to declare the gold and silver coins as legal tender, but they can't mint the coins themselves. That power was given to the federal government in Article 1, Section 8. If you look at Clause 5, it says Congress has the power to coin money and regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin and fix the standards of weights and measures. Now, what does that mean? That means the federal government can take money, which would be gold and silver, because that's the only thing the states can make legal tender, and make the coins that would then circulate as legal tender among the states. Now, there's nothing in Article 1, Section 8 that allows the federal government to make anything legal tender. So it can't. It's only the states that can make legal tender, and all they can make is gold and silver, but they can't coin money. The federal government does that, but all they can coin is gold and silver, because if they coin anything else, it can't be legal tender. Now, in theory, they did coin other things. They coined copper to make pennies, and they coined nickels to make nickel, or they coined nickel. But those coins were not legal tender. They still circulated in commerce as a medium of exchange, but nobody made them legal tender. So bills had to be paid legally in gold and silver. You couldn't just pay your bills in pennies. I mean, if you wanted to, you could, but if the counterparty demanded gold and silver, that's what you would have to pay in. Now, all of these official measures were defined, according to the Constitution, in 1792 by the Coinage Act. And in that act, the dollar was legally defined as a weight of silver. The definition of a dollar is 371.25 grains of silver. Troy grains of silver. That's what the dollar is. The dollar is a unit of measurement for a quantity of gold. And the reason they picked that number, 371.25 grains, is because that's how many grains were in the Spanish mill dollar. And so they wanted the US dollar to be on par with the Spanish mill dollar, which was a coin that was heavily circulated in the colonies before the Constitution, and so it was a well-regarded coin, and so they were making a coin to compete with the Spanish mill dollar, and so it had the same amount of silver. Now, at the same time they did that, they also established a gold weight for the dollar, and they fixed the ratio at 15 to 1. So based on the dollar being defined as 371.25 troy grains of fine silver, the dollar was then defined as 24.75 grains of gold, right? And so the official ratio at that time was 15 to 1. So you needed 15 ounces of silver to get 1 ounce of gold. Now, we've been talking a lot recently about the gold-silver ratio, which today is at 83 to 1, and which in March was at a ridiculous over 120 to 1. But this puts this in some context. When we're talking about that ratio right now, it's 83 to 1. Back in 1792, the ratio was 15 to 1. So silver had a lot more value relative to gold back in 1792 than it does today. And that shows you that silver obviously has a long way to go. Now, I doubt it's going to get all the way back up to that ratio, but I think it's going to get a lot closer than the 83 to 1 that it's at today. Now, those ratios remained the same all the way until 1849. So the dollar's value didn't change at all until the Coinage Act in 1849. There was a lot of pressure for more silver coinage. And so what they ended up doing is they slightly devalued silver relative to gold. So the official price of silver, which actually had been set at $1.29, that was the price of silver in the Coinage Act of 1792, $1.29. The official gold price was $19.39, right, based on the weights that they ascribed. So gold was $19.39 and silver was $1.29. In 1849, they changed that and they moved the ratio 16 to 1. So now gold, the price was increased from $19.39, where it had been since 1792. Remember, this is 1849. It's over 50 years later, right? The dollar has been exactly stable. And now they raised the price of gold to $20.67, right? And a new ratio was 16 to 1. And, just so you see how that works, the coins that were in circulation, right, at the time or following that act, right, you had the silver coins, which were the dimes, the quarters, the half dollars, and the dollars, right? They were all made of silver. So one silver dollar, Morgan silver dollar, right, are the ones that a lot of people know now that we have. You can get the Morgan silver dollar or the Peace silver dollar. All of those have the required amount of silver in order to be a dollar, right? And the gold coins, they were broken down into an eagle, right? A full eagle was a $10 gold coin. You can get a half eagle, which was $5, and a quarter eagle was $2.50. And the largest gold coin was the double eagle, which was $20, right? So if you had a $20 double eagle, that was the same as having 20 Morgan silver dollars. And if you added up all the silver in those 20 Morgan silver dollars, right, relative to how much gold was in that one double eagle, you had 16 times as much silver as you did gold, because that was the official ratio between the two metals. But both were considered legal tender, and they were both dollars. And that's where everything stayed until the Federal Reserve came in 1913, right? So this is 121 years after the price of gold was initially set at $19.39, right? 120 years, the price had gone up about $1, right? From 1939 to $20.67. And that's when the Federal Reserve comes on the scene and starts printing money, right? But of course, when the Federal Reserve began to print money, right, it issued Federal Reserve notes. It didn't issue dollars, it issued Federal Reserve notes. Well, what's the difference? A Federal Reserve note is a promise to pay dollars. That's what a note is. And if you look at a Federal Reserve note, it says this note is legal tender, right, for all debts, public and private. But what it used to say underneath that language is, and is payable to the bearer on demand, $10 in gold or silver, right? So the Federal Reserve note was a promise to pay dollars. The dollars were the gold or silver that the Federal Reserve had on deposit. And if you took one of those notes to a Federal Reserve bank, you could get actual dollars. You didn't have dollars when you had a Federal Reserve note. You had the Federal Reserve's promise to pay dollars. That's why Federal Reserve notes are liabilities. They were a liability of the Fed, and those liabilities were backed up by their assets. What were their assets? The assets were gold and silver that they held. And you could take those bearer instruments on demand to a Federal Reserve Bank and get your dollars for your notes, right? That was legitimate. The Federal Reserve notes started out as legitimate currency. Of course, that ended. They're no longer legitimate currency, right? Richard Nixon ended that. But before Nixon ended it, Roosevelt intervened during the Depression, 1934. He devalued the dollar and rose the price of gold up to 35. Right? So now it went from $20.67 up to $35 after Roosevelt basically confiscated all the gold, required Americans to turn in their gold, and then made it illegal for Americans to own gold, right? But they can still own silver, right? And our coins were still made of silver, and that didn't end until 1964. That's when they took all the silver out of our coins, and that's when all our coins became counterfeit tokens, right? Because if you look at a coin today, whether it's a half dollar or a quarter, if you turn it on an edge, it's all orangey because it's full of copper, right? There's no silver in there anymore. They make these coins to look like they're made of silver because they took copper and they basically plated it with nickel to make it look like silver, but it really wasn't, right? They were just counterfeiting. In fact, the reason that you have those ridge marks on the sides of quarters and dimes is because they needed to make sure that people wouldn't scrape off any of the silver. They wouldn't clip the coin, because if you had a quarter and you scraped off some of the silver, it would no longer be legal tender because it wouldn't have the required amount of silver. So it wouldn't really constitute, right? If you have a silver dollar, for it to be a real dollar, it has to have the right amount of silver. And if you scrape some of the silver off, then it was no longer legal tender. So the way you would know if somebody clipped the coin is you would look at the mill marks. And if it looked like they had been shaved, you wouldn't accept it. Because what people can do is they could shave a little bit of silver off of every coin, and then they could melt it down and, make another coin or have some silver. But they didn't have mill marks on a nickel or a penny because nobody would waste their time clipping copper or nickel because the metal didn't have enough value. So when they made these counterfeit quarters and dimes out of nickel and copper, they put those mill marks on them anyway. Even though there was no need to put the mill marks because there wasn't enough metal in there worth clipping, they just wanted to fool people. See, initially, back in the 1960s, people didn't realize that the government made the switch. They didn't know that they no longer had real silver, right? That the government just conned everybody by debasing the coinage. But then ultimately, what they did, and Richard Nixon, he ended up devaluing the dollar twice before he completely severed the link to gold, right? He took it from $35 an ounce. He devalued to $38, so he raised the gold price up to $38 an ounce. And then he raised it again to $42.22. Not really sure why he came up with that number, $42.22. And then we just went off the gold standard. But $42.22, that's still the official price of gold. That is the legal value of the dollar by law. That's where it's set. Even though the market price is now over $1,900, the last official price was $42.22. But of course, what we did with our legitimate currency is we removed all the language that made the notes legitimate, all the language that reflected the promise to pay. And so instead of the Federal Reserve note saying, I promise to pay you $20, it promises to pay nothing. It's an IOU nothing. Instead of saying this note is legal tender for all debt, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank, they cut off all that part, and it just says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. That's it. But nowhere on the Federal Reserve note does it claim to be a dollar. I mean, it has the word dollar written on it, but so what? You can write anything on there. I mean, it has, the names of presidents on there. It doesn't mean that that's an actual president. What the notes claim to be are notes. Just read it. It says this note. It doesn't say this dollar. This note is legal tender, right? And, my father used to give an example that makes a lot of sense. It's like, let's say you went and checked your coat at a restaurant, and you go in there and you give them your coat, and then they give you a little piece of paper that's a receipt for that coat, right? And so you hold on to this little coat check, and then when it's time to leave, right, you give them the piece of paper, and they give you your coat back. But what if while you were having dinner, they stole your coat? And then when you come back, let's say that the check actually had something on it and it said, good for one coat. Normally they don't have anything. But let's say that when you gave them your coat, they gave you a note that basically says, I owe you one coat because they have your coat, right? And so then you come back and you give them this slip wanting to get your coat back, but it's not there because they stole it. And so they just scratch off I owe you from the note and they just hand you back the note that says one coat and they say, here's your coat. Well, that's not a coat. You can't wear that. It's a piece of paper. Yes, but it says one coat on it. Who cares? It doesn't matter what it says. What matters is what it is. That's what the Federal Reserve note did with their IOUs, with their liabilities. People had Federal Reserve notes, and the Federal Reserve note says, promise to pay you $1 or $10 or $20. And the dollars that it promised to pay were made of gold or silver. But then you go back to the Federal Reserve with the note and you want to get the gold and silver, and all they do is scratch off, right? Pay you $10 in gold or $20 in gold, and they just give you back their note, and it just says $10 on it. Right? What's that? Did you get your dollars? No. The dollars were the gold that they had in depository. They're not giving you the dollars. They're just giving you back a piece of paper with the word $1 written on it. They're giving you back the same note. They just crossed off all the language that made them liable to pay. But anyway, that's a brief history of how we went from legal money, constitutional gold and silver money, as authorized by the U.S. Constitution, to a Federal Reserve that initially issued legitimate currency backed by real money, gold and silver, to the situation we have now where we have a Federal Reserve issuing fiat currency backed by nothing, right? And now, if you look back at the dates that I gave you, in 1792, right, the price of gold was $19.39. When the Federal Reserve was created 121 years later, in 1913, the price of gold was at $20.67. It was almost the same price because the value of money was very stable, right? In fact, from 1800 to 1900, the CPI was cut in half. So prices were half as much in 1900 as they were in 1800. So we had 100 years of falling prices. And during that time, we had tremendous prosperity. We had the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the latter part of the 19th century, after the Civil War, and between the introduction of the Federal Reserve, the U.S. economy boomed like never before. I mean, Donald Trump likes to pretend that we had the greatest economy ever. It pales in comparison to what was going on during the Gilded Age when we had sound money. But ever since the Federal Reserve came into being, the dollar began to decline. And now, 107 years after the establishment of the Federal Reserve, the price of gold has gone from $20.67 when it began in 1913 to over $1,900 today. That's almost a 99% decline in the value of the dollar. In fact, it's almost exactly a 99% decline if you go back to the original Coinage Act of 1792. So relative to what the dollar was worth in 1792, it only has 1% of its purchasing power, right? That's why everything costs so much more now than it cost back then, because the dollar has been debased. Had we maintained the dollar's value all of these years, had we maintained it for the 107 years since the Federal Reserve was created, the same way we retained it for the 121 years before it was created, we would still have very low prices. We would still have enjoyed the benefit of falling prices. We'd still probably have a small government and we'd have a lot of economic freedom. It was the debasement of the money. It was the rejection of constitutional money and empowering the government to run these big deficits, the Federal Reserve to print all this money. That is the reason that we've seen this huge degradation in our standard of living. And it's about to get a lot worse because here's the deal. The dollar has lost 99% of its value. There's only 1% left as measured by the value in 1792. And if we lose that last 1%, that's the killer. Because if we lose another 1%, the dollar is worthless. Now, I know a lot of people will think, well, we're not going to lose another 1% from here, right? Maybe we'll lose another 99%, but that's practically 100%. But the point is, there's not a lot of value left for the Fed to destroy. And they're about to do that. And this is a major, major financial crisis that is waiting just over the horizon. This is not just a mere financial crisis. This is a currency crisis. This is a sovereign debt crisis. This is going to make the 2008 financial crisis look like a Sunday school picnic. This is going to make anything that we've experienced since COVID-19 look like a Sunday school picnic. Yet all of the experts, all the people that supposedly know so much, all the financial media, all these big economists, everybody in government, right? They are completely oblivious to what's about to happen. But at least the people who are listening to the Peter Schiff Show podcast know what's going to happen. They're going to understand what's going to happen. They're going to know why it's happening. And if you take action, you'll be prepared for what's going to happen, which is probably the most important thing, to not only understand what's going to happen, but to financially prepare yourself for what's about to happen.